I want to thank everybody for coming today. My name is Dave Zapponi. I'm the president and CEO of ECHO, otherwise known as the Educational Council of Homeowners. Thank you for participating in today's webinar, Community Conversation about governing documents. Is it time to update? ECHO is a 50-year-old statewide nonprofit association which supports HOA board members and engaged homeowners. Our mission is to foster a better quality of life in community associations through education, advocacy, and connections. For today's event, we have a few housekeeping items. These are now presented on the screen. In addition, slides were sent to registered attendees beforehand. Please take a moment and review our housekeeping items. Please use the chat icon to report technical issues and to communicate directly with other participants. Use the Q&A feature to ask questions. We do not monitor the chat feature for questions. Today, we have a large audience of HOA board members. We will do our best to answer your questions, but we may run out of time. We actually likely will run out of time. Today, to help us select the most relevant questions, please use the thumbs up icon found in the Q&A feature. Simply click this upvote icon to select your favorite questions. We do answer some of the questions we answer the questions with the most upvotes first. Please keep your questions general in nature and short. Questions about specific situations are better asked of the attorney serving your association or another appropriate industry professionals familiar with your specific situation. I will respond in writing to some questions in the Q&A feature during the presentation. All other questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Now let me direct your attention to the monitor where you will find our disclaimer. None of what is said during this seminar shall be construed as specific legal advice or expert advice from the speaker, sponsors, or ECHO. If you wish specific advice, we encourage you to contact your attorney or another suitable expert. The information we provide during this webinar is educational in nature and should not be relied upon for specific decision-making purposes. Thank you. This event, as well as all our events, are made possible because of our generous contributions by professional sponsors. Please join me in thanking today's Q&A sponsor, the Kevin Boland Insurance Agency, and today's registration sponsor, Levy Erlinger and Company, LLP, CPAs. Please support our professional members and especially our sponsors. They make our educational programming possible at little or no cost to you. And now for today's presentation. Glenn Youngling, Esquire, is a sole practitioner. He became extensively involved with community associations in the mid-1970s while still attending UC Hastings Law School. Over the past 40 years, he has focused his practice on common interest developments and HOA law. He spent many of his early years of practice in construction defect litigation, which evolved into HOA general counsel and helping boards better run their associations. Glenn now has reached a point in his career where he is winding down general counsel services and focusing on helping communities update their governing documents. He has been a speaker in more than 50 seminars and authored dozens of articles on nearly every facet of community association challenges. In addition, he is a court expert with opinions on standard of care for directors. It is with great pleasure and appreciation that we welcome Glenn Youngling here today to discuss governing documents. Thank you. And Glenn, go ahead and take it away.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Dave. After all of the decades of working with associations, I can tell you that, as an attorney, we often have to work with facts and law that are kind of thrust upon us from the outside. And I will tell you, the secret of being able to write your own documents is a wonderful thing. How often in life do you get to write your own rules? Requires a little bit of effort up front, thinking it through, but it is a great opportunity to be proactive. I'm passionate about governing documents, and not very many people like to talk to me about them because they think it's like, oh, so boring. But I hope that you'll find that there's more to it than just that. We're going to walk through a variety of facets of governing documents. And I think we might as well start with, well, what are they? The term is defined in the Davis-Sterling Act. And for those of you who haven't run across it, Davis-Sterling Act is the portion of the Civil Code where the legislature dumps all of the statutes that they want to deal with associations. And so governing documents is a broad term because it's the A to Z of things that regulate, set standards for associations. The CC&Rs, Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, is really the backbone. That's the real meat of the documents, and we'll spend most of our time talking about CC&Rs today. Articles of Incorporation, they're with the Secretary of State, and if you're ever curious and you go online, you can look at, if you search for SOS, and then CA, biz search, you'll probably find that you can look up any business in there, type in the name of an association, and you can actually see the forms that get filed every couple of years there. You can even see if you're suspended as a corporation. But at any rate, it's sort of a placeholder. Those are not significant, and it's enormously rare that anybody would ever bother to look at the articles. Bylaws, that's procedure. But more and more, with the bylaws, the legislature has taken the standards of running a corporation and moved them from the Corporations Code more and more into the Davis-Sterling Act itself. And then they've tinkered with them to create new laws and standards and procedures that go into the bylaws. The bylaws are often the province more of property managers, if you have a professional property manager, because it's process, it's not the real substance. And a lot of managers they keep up with the notices and the voting and the meetings and the publications and the financials and all of those things. Those standards are in the bylaws. Those are pretty cut and dried. Rules and policies. Everybody imagines pool rules or something similar to that, but there can be any set of rules. Some associations have 10 or 15 different policies or rules dealing with different subjects. The ones that are required include a collection policy. Legislature says you have to have one. You have to have voting rules. That's required. And architectural procedures. And one of the things when the legislature says you must adopt a policy, and they've done it for these three subjects and even some others, I think it's their effort to try and bridge the gap between outdated old governing documents that are difficult to update and the new law. So the board can adopt the policy that bridges that gap and get good information out to the owners about some of the key subjects. But rules and policies are, the bottom of the pecking order. Really, where we want to talk about most of the things today is going to be back in the CC&Rs. What's the hierarchy when you start looking at the documents themselves? Davis-Sterling Act even addresses that. Generally, it's going to be the law. There's statutory and case law out there, but that's followed quickly by the CC&Rs. And then articles are a little below that, bylaws, and then rules and policies are at the bottom. That means that if there's a conflict here, that in most instances, that's the hierarchy. You're going to be law, CC&Rs. By the time you get to articles, bylaws, especially rules and policies, if there's a conflict, they're going to fail or fall behind these other greater authorities. One of the things that you have to be aware of in the back of your head, though, is when you wander through the Davis-Sterling Act statutes, you'll see in there often the law actually says, unless otherwise provided in, sometimes the declaration, sometimes the governing documents, unless otherwise provided in, then this is what you do. And the what you do is one size fits all. You know, the smallest association I've worked with was a 2-unit condominium, just an abomination when you think about why anybody would do that. Largest has been close to 6,000 homes. And when you see, unless otherwise provided in the documents, one size fits all, it really fits none. But it gives you the opportunity in the statutes of the Davis-Sterling to say, hey, we don't want the default. We don't want that. We want to customize it. So there are many of the opportunities are there where you can actually update the documents and get your preferences in. So one of the questions that I get often is, well, how often should we be doing our documents? And that's obviously in the title. And a lot of you are probably thinking that. In new projects, I would say if you're brand new and the developer is out of the picture, at 5 or 6 years is probably a good time to start thinking about that first time, because the developer sets often have a lot of extra junk related to the development in there, and you know, the people that draft those are really trying to impress lenders, not scare buyers, and they don't put a lot of the detail in that's going to be useful for later on. But after a decent set is in place, my rule of thumb would be 10 years. And there's some things we can do to prolong the life of your documents before you have to go through the whole process again. But at 10 years, you should be asking yourself, is it time? And the answer may be, I think we can stretch a little more, or maybe we should start that process now. So it's kind of a give or take. And what eventually are the reasons for it? You get to the 10 years. Well, first of all, the law changes every single year. They're putting out the changes, that tinker, and sometimes it's a little, sometimes it's a lot, and that erodes the reliability of the documents. Demographics change, the age of your buildings change, and experience with the buildings and the people change, and eventually you find that problems you didn't have in the past may be problems that you need help with now in the governing documents. And so eventually, I think 10 years is a good rule of thumb. And if you're out at 15 or 18 years, it's too long. And one of the problems with leaving it too long is boards then tend to ignore it because they don't have solutions. And ignoring those standards is always not a good thing, because if an owner comes along and challenges the board acting beyond the scope of the governing documents, it can lead to, there can be legal consequences, but there's also credibility issue when the person in the back row jumps up and says, you're in violation of the bylaws. And you have to say, yes, but. Anytime you find yourself saying yes, but in a hostile environment, you've got a problem. So good idea. I think rule of thumb, 10 years. And it's possible to do mini amendments and a few other things along the way, but 10 years, you should be looking at the whole document. Okay, well, updating the governing documents, what's the process? First thing is selecting counsel, and in the Bay Area, expanded Bay Area, even Northern California, we're fortunate because there are a fair number of practitioners who have lots of experience with associations. And this is not, drafting documents is not something that should come off the shelf. You really need to be hands-on, understanding associations and understanding how the documents dovetail into the factual scenarios that are out there. Selecting counsel, there are some pretty good people that are out there. The thing you want to make absolutely sure of is that they've got a lot of practical experience. You want to know the person working on the documents actually understands the nature of the beast. And I would say, you know, if it's somebody who says, I can do that, I've done it before, and I've done 5 or 6 sets, that's probably not the best person for you. They don't know what the nuances are. They don't spend enough time keeping up on those details, and they won't get you all the bells and whistles that will serve you best longest. So, but fortunately, they're out there. And for those of us who do governing documents, we're very much accustomed to having management companies or someone else say, could you provide us with a proposal? And so you may want to get a couple of proposals and get a sense for what's out there being offered. Different approaches. There are different styles to this. And I've heard some attorneys will go to the shelf and they have what's called a template, and they pull the template down and then they study your existing documents and your association, and they make changes on the template. The template's well organized, good headings and table of contents, all of that, and they plug those things in. Personally, I think that works for bylaws, because bylaws don't have a lot of wiggle room around them. They are process set forth in statutes. But when you get into the CC&Rs, my own personal preference is redlining, and it takes a little bit longer, but it permits people to see how you're changing the document when the directors and volunteers are working with looking at it, and we can then go through several generations of changes. And the redlining provides a degree of security, and also make sure that we don't wander too far from what the community has been accustomed to over the years. How much does it cost? That's a good question, and I could tell you that you know, a lot of associations, I'll say, budget at $10,000. Most of the attorneys who will do this do it on a flat fee for the first portion and then hourly after that. The flat fee portion is in the drafting, the heavy lifting, the familiarization, that sort of thing, and it allows associations to budget. And then beyond that, the other portion of the budget is really about talking. And with attorneys, as you know, talk ain't cheap. And so we can't control that, and attorneys won't be building in open-ended for talking through issues. But if you're thinking of about a budget, you might bring it in at less than 10. It might be a little bit over, but it's a good question to ask. And what are the averages for the clients that attorneys work with? And they should be able to tell you. Assisting counsel effectively, what can you do to make the attorney's job easier or better? The last thing you want to do is say, well, we have our first draft and we'd like you to critique it. But the problem with that is that, we do quite a few documents and we're up on things. And it's easier for us to do the first draft and then provide it to the volunteers to vet that document instead of the other way around. So one of the things that I like is if you come up with your own hit list or wish list. And honestly, what I like, I'm going to do it whether a client does it or not. I like to go to as many years of minutes as the client will provide, and I skim through. I just fly through and I write down the things that I see on that list, create my own little hit list. And in the material that you're going to get with the email after this presentation is over, I've got a hit list like that. And your hit list to the attorney will help. Anything about insurance claims, anything about problems, political or otherwise, come up with that list. Or maybe it's just a wish list that, last time you had difficulty getting the members to approve borrowing because borrowing required approval of a majority or some large number of the members. Get that wish list out there so that you can hand it to counsel at the front end and your own little hit list. All right, so what are the biggest reasons to amend? Well, I could say there are top 5 reasons on the next slide, but the reality is there is almost an endless number of reasons people want to amend. Removing outdated references. Often it's the developer. Sometimes it's outdated law, conforming to statutes. Clarifying assignment of responsibilities. That's huge, 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 huge. That's the balance of maintenance, repair, and replacement that takes place, and how you allocate that between the association and the individual owners. Original documents generally do not do a good job of saying who's responsible for the doorknob, the doorbell, the exterior light, who's responsible for, maybe the door itself, the hinges, the gate in the yard, who's responsible for so many different facets. And construction is so different and people's preferences are very different. But that's where you really need to spend some time thinking, what do I want to get ahead of here? Updating enforcement tools. So often, especially in original documents, the solution is that if the association's having a problem with an owner and wants to enforce, the answer is hire a lawyer and file a lawsuit. That's the last thing you want to do in a situation like this. The legislature has put in some alternative dispute resolution, such as mediation and face-to-face meetings. But in the end, if the association levies a fine of $100 or has had to do repairs to the common area and cost several thousand, you're going to find a good enforcement tool sitting in the assessment section, and it should be under a reimbursement assessment or something similar. And when you look at that, many documents say that you can't collect that using a lien or non-judicial foreclosure. And if that's there, then that means you're going to have to file a lawsuit ultimately, even if it's small claims, as enforcement. The authority there to lien to get reimbursed is enormous leverage and to be used sparingly, but it's an important enforcement tool. Revisiting risk management provisions. Boy, I'll tell you, in the last 5 or 6 years with all the fires that have happened, and cumulatively, I've just been around for a lot of floods, broken pipes, all kinds of things that go wrong. And when you go into the risk management sections, that's a balance of who insures it, how is it insured, how does the insurance claim get handled, what's for the master policy, what's for the individual owner. And then just as important, that spills over into the dreaded section, damage and destruction, which is usually there's been a significant fire or a big flood or huge windstorm damage. And you get into the damage and destruction section, and it's really This is the ugly stuff where there's been something seriously wrong. You've probably got displaced people. And I still see on a regular basis in damage and destruction that the association shall, within, for example, 90 days, procure 3 bids, select the successful bidder, and start within 4 or 5 months. Anybody who's been through a big casualty event knows that it doesn't work that way. The first thing you got to do is hire an engineer and or architect. They're going to have to be submitting plans to the building department. The insurance company is going to take some time to come up to speed, to prime the pump with dollars for all of this effort. And for a substantial casualty, people may be out of their homes for a year or even longer. The damage and destruction section is the roadmap for how you're going to manage that. And if you have an old or outdated, or read it, if it's impractical, that's a place you should go and hope that you never have to use it. But it's certainly an important part of the documents. Adding flexibility is also another big reason to amend. What do I mean by flexibility? It's kind of setting the balance between what's carved in stone in a way by the CC&Rs, or maybe even the bylaws, and what goes into policies that the board can change more easily as preferences change over time. So you can have general rules and you can have exceptions. Building those things in will give you flexibility for your documents. Okay, so owner association, let's talk maintenance and repair and replacement. The Davis-Sterling Act actually talks about maintenance, repair, and replacement. And when you think about it, those are 3 different concepts. And so Davis-Sterling will tell you, for example, if somebody has a deck surface that's elastomeric, the owner maintains it by washing it off and keeping it free of debris. But if it needs repair, that's going to be the association probably, and ultimately replacement. But you can tip those 3 responsibilities in the governing documents themselves. And often you're going to want to tip that responsibility different ways for different features. I mean, you might want the exterior light fixture to be maintained by the owner. If there's a switch on the inside, they change the bulb. But if you want to keep the fixtures looking the same on the outside, repair or replacement might be the association. Any rate, but when you look at the different facets of the building, and I can sit and be interested looking at the outside of a building and a handful of photographs, and in 20 minutes come up with a list of 30 different features where the balance might be shifted one way or the other. And in deciding how that goes, we look to see, are there economies of scale where the association can come in and offer good value in taking care of this? Is there easy access, or is access really difficult? If you have to arrange to have separate access and have somebody stay home, and then the contractor is going to go in, and if access becomes a big issue, maybe it should be the owners who are taking care of that. Who insures it? How's it been handled in the reserve study? Life safety is obviously one where you can lean more towards the association, making sure these things get handled. Historical practices, you can change status quo. The courts have said that just because you bought in under one set of CC&Rs doesn't mean that the community doesn't have the authority to just reset that balance. So sometimes you got to start with a clean slate, especially in older associations where they've been inconsistent practices, and somebody's always going to say, that's not the way we did it before, and this isn't fair, you can't do that. You actually can, but you need to think it through and have a rational basis for the change. But look at the historical practices and decide you want to keep them and reflect them in documents. They may not be in the documents, but if it's been working for you for years, plug it in so it's official. Different patterns of use and abuse. Yeah, we get if some owners use something a lot and other ones barely use it. Fireplaces might be an example. Who should be cleaning the fireplace flues? You know, some people never use it. Some might have installed gas. Some have the wood burning, and other people use scrap wood and that sort of thing. And that kind of tells you that this should be an owner responsibility because of the different levels of use. So there are those various things to consider with each of the components when you ask yourself, should we maintain, repair, or replace? Popular subjects. On the next slide, it's your imagination is unlimited in this. Pets are always a big one, and boy, I tell you, somewhere along the line, chickens became a big deal. And I'll tell you, there's nothing that'll split a community faster than love or hate of chickens. But you want to cover those kinds of things in a pet section. I've heard people talk about, well, we want dogs. We want to regulate dogs. I had one high rise where the only rule related to the size of a pet was that the owner had to be able to carry it from the front door of the unit all the way down through the elevator and out to the street. Well, that pretty much eliminated the large dogs for people trying to carry them. But the little dogs were often causing more problems. So with pets, it's often you get the basics in there, and then you specify the variables that the board can work with in a rule or a policy. And so think about flexibility, especially with pets. Solar and batteries. Solar is a big deal now, and everybody understands if the roof is going to work, you can put the old-fashioned panels that are rack mounted on the roof. But more and more now, we're seeing shingles, we're seeing roof replacements, we're seeing pieces that go in almost like a skylight that are dovetailed into the roofing around. These are popular subjects because when you're looking at it, there's going to be a maintenance cost and a responsibility later on down the line. Good to add that now, especially if it's a condominium. It's partially regulated by the Davis-Sterling Act. Wall batteries are now a big deal. So these are things to think about and get into the documents. Electric vehicle charging stations, boy, here they come. And for those of us who watch these things regularly, there's a lot coming down the path. In new construction, it's all going to be required. Older construction, it's going to creep in. But then there's the practical side of people are buying these vehicles. And if they park in a carport, how are they going to charge the vehicle when they're home? It adds to the value of the property. So boards should be thinking long-term, how are we going to phase this in so it's more accessible? And then there's the practical problem of inadequate delivery of electricity. And, how is that going to get handled? Or first come, first serve if you don't have enough juice to run 5 or 6 people with their own stations. Start thinking about that. Start laying the groundwork both in the CC&Rs, but also you should end up with a policy there. Sewer laterals, another great subject. And I will tell you that if you're in a community that doesn't require either condominiums to upgrade their sewers on a regular basis or in a planned development on sale, many of the districts are requiring that they be checked and often replaced. Think about the sewer laterals. You want to address it in the document. In a planned development, most of the owners are going to say, my lateral goes to my lot line, and then it's common area after that. So I'll pay for the first half of this, and you pay for the second. Well, I don't happen to agree with that, but now you've got an argument going. With sewer laterals, you want to be clear who's responsible to maintain, repair, and replace. And it may be that there are 2 or 3 people in an older complex that have lines that merge, and who's going to take care of those? You need to think it through. That's expensive stuff when you have to do either trench or trenchless, as they call some of this work. It's expensive. The documents ought to have sewer laterals addressed as a subject matter. Also, underground pipes and where they may corrode, and who's responsible for utility lines between the meter and the individual unit. Generators, another big subject area. Boy, I tell you, when we first started having our power outages, people would get the contractor generators out and fire those things up. Kind of a nuisance. And just think about how you want to moderate that. There are now some ordinances that have been adopted by certain communities, but not too many. You want the authority to regulate the use, the sound, really, and location of generators. In planned developments, you're going to find some people putting in the big Generacs, and those are like they're bigger than an air conditioning unit outside, and they do generate noise. So think about what you want to put in there. This is a trend that's going to be in the future, and you might as well get ahead of it. Remodeling, we're going to talk a little bit more about that as a popular subject to help you think it through. Second units, often called ADUs or JADUs, auxiliary dwelling units. These are now the law. If owners meet certain criteria in a planned development, they can put a second unit in. You might as well get ahead of that to make sure your architectural control permits you to you can't say no, but you can put reasonable conditions on it. So think about it proactively, get it in the documents, and hopefully avoid a problem before it comes down the line. All right. Let's talk architectural alterations for a moment. This is a huge area that you should be getting ahead of, and you want to beef it up either in the CC&Rs or perhaps spilling more over into a policy. The important part about the CC&Rs is especially in condominiums, people intrude into common area and they don't even think about it. They may be into the wiring, into the wall space. They may be altering plumbing in the walls. And what do your documents say about anybody who alters that? And I'll give you a clue. The person who has the plumbing problem isn't going to be the person who hired the unlicensed contractor. It's going to be the person who bought. And the person who bought's going to turn to the condominium board and say, that's common area, it's in the wall. I don't care who did it, you're responsible. So think about how you're going to regulate intrusions into common area with or without permission, may not even know about it, but your opportunity is to get language into the document that is going to decide the fight before it gets started. Time to decide or deemed approved. That watch in your architectural sections, especially developer documents or older documents, they'll say if the association doesn't respond within 30 or 60 days, it's deemed approved. That is deadly because I've seen people do that when they know the board isn't going to be around. They're off on vacation for a month or a month and a half, and the timing goes in so nobody's at home to respond, and bang, it's deemed approved. So pull that time bomb out. If it's planned development, you might put in that it's deemed approved if it hasn't been responded to in, for example, 60 days, and there's been a notice in writing to the president and management that there's been no response, and it builds something in so that it's not automatically deemed approved. There's some safety in the process there. Contractor licenses and insurance, you certainly want to make sure that all of that's done. It's good to refer to it in the documents so that owners can't say, well, nobody told me my handyman was a good guy, or especially in condominiums, they'll go get a building permit and they'll say it's owner work. Well, owner shouldn't be working without a license in the common area. So make sure that the work, especially if it touches common area, has got the right contractor license and insurance. Successor liability for predecessor alterations, really, really important. I seriously went through a situation with several floors in a condominium. People did hire an unlicensed contractor who did bathroom remodel, including a tub shower and tile and whatnot. They eventually sold, moved to Palm Springs. New owner came in and the tile started falling off the wall. And this was years later, and the whole wall was decayed, not only at that unit, but the unit down below. They ended up shoring the place down below. It was filled with decay. And the new owner said, hey, not my problem. I'm responsible for the unit, not the common area. If you need to go against the prior owner or contractor if you want. And I looked at that and I thought, that's really not a good scenario, that all of the other owners should be paying for something that was somebody's error, if you will. And so I think that every set of documents should say that that when an owner does an alteration, the successor owners are responsible for that alteration as well, wherever it's located. If you have that language in there, you can avoid a huge fight. In the bathroom scenario I was talking about, the legal fees alone were $100,000, and the cost of repair was about the same. Just think about that line being in those documents. If it was there, all of that could have been avoided. Debris boxes and the duration of the job, building permits, all of these things are there. Sometimes you'll tip it towards a policy. Other times you should get the basics. And the basics might include the CC&R saying that the board can adopt a policy or regulations addressing such subjects as, and then stick them all in there. Building code trigger upgrades. Yeah, this is it's a good one, because what we find now is that if, as this happened to a couple of times with clients I've seen, where they go to do siding work around a window and the building official says, well, because you're touching the area of the window at the corners, you now need to upgrade the window to wildland urban interface for fire purposes. It's got to be a higher grade window. Well, if owners are responsible for windows and the association triggers the need to change it, how are you going to handle that? And there are several different ways, but you should think about it ahead of time, because you can decide what's going to work best for your association. So other aspects of architectural, regulating the type of work and the timing, that often has to do with the time of day, regulating access, making sure that you've got contractors and coming in and out with buildings with interior hallways. That's pretty critical, or elevators especially. Change order approval. Every job changes, and after an owner has approval from the board, does your agreement with the owner say that they have to come back for approvals if there are change orders? Windows and doors and how they get integrated. Think about these things. Windows and doors cause enormous headaches in the weatherproofing of the exterior. Why not just be real clear, especially if somebody is altering their own window or door to do an upgrade? Changing the nature of aesthetics. Boy, I'll tell you, we put into our documents now, and I would encourage everybody else to put this on your wish list, that the board of directors, after a certain amount of time notice to the owners, can change the color of the project. You'd be amazed. I look back at some of the 1970s projects, and there's nothing that looks better than sprucing up the color. But many documents don't provide for that. Then you get into a big fight. Does the board have the discretion to change the color? Where does it permit them to do that in the documents? And if it's a planned development where the owner owns the property, you've got a big community debate. Get ahead of it with deciding who can changing nature of aesthetics and how or a process if you're going to make a change like that in the community. Solar roofing we touched on, accessory dwelling units, wildland interface. These are all good subjects to talk about. Plan through the problems and get them to be addressed. Okay, next up on more popular subjects, vehicles and parking. You know, it's always going to be a problem, and it's going to get worse with new projects. What do you do with vehicles and parking? Something to understand is, we generally put more detail in vehicles and parking than we do, for example, into pets, because in the hierarchy of documents, if it's in the CC&Rs, it's presumptively valid and very difficult to challenge that standard. If it's in rules and regulations, the board of directors of the association has the burden of showing that it's reasonable. So we will often take vehicles and parking and push more into the CC&Rs than in a policy, because we want that traction to deal with the parking problems, the size, the vehicle restrictions, and public streets. A lot of documents, they're not clear. If can somebody park their RV on the public street in the subdivision? And I think for most people that study it, they say that if it's a public street in the subdivision, you might not be able to regulate the street per se, but you can regulate the vehicles and the owners, the residents, in your documents. So think about that. Fines, towing, driveway, garage use for storage. These are all things that should be touched on in the documents. Driveway use, and some associations will permit, some don't. Identification of vehicles is a big deal. Might as well put it in the documents that upon request, the association can find out all of the vehicles associated with that household. That will help you in regulating, limiting the number of charges or vehicles that are in there. So pros and cons of putting the detail in, but definitely vehicles and parking is a traditional subject to spend some significant time on. Think about what it is that you want. Okay, next slide. In more popular things to address. Now, you know, I'm old guard. I kind of believe my home is my castle. I don't want an association coming through my door. And whether that's a planned development, where it's very true, or even a condominium, you still have to ask yourself, are people going to be taking care of certain key facets inside their home? And why does the association have an interest, or why should it care? The answer is mostly that it's the master insurance policy. Even in a planned development where the association shouldn't be thinking about refrigerators or water heaters or chimney flues or those sorts of things, the reality is if there's a master policy and you start to have quite a few water losses, you're going to lose the carrier, your premiums are going to go up, and it's going to cause problems. So all of a sudden we find that in areas the association might not want to get involved in, you kind of take the opportunity to create a safety net. And we call these high risk components because we see so many insurance claims coming out of these things or other debates. And might as well put in there who's going to be responsible for these things. And it's troubleshooting. And you know, in the sections that we come up with, the association has the ability to require owners to check. Now, sometimes that checklist is owner before we, you know, as part of the sale, we want you to go look under the refrigerator to see if there's dust bunnies there to make sure the ice line isn't leaking, the ice maker supply line, water heaters, check those for overflow, chimney flues, washing machine hoses and reaching to see if those are dry or have a drip, that sort of thing. Shut off valves, will they open and close? Those are all owner responsibilities, but they can convert to big insurance claims. The first time I ran into this was many years ago, and it was a new complex. All of the water heaters started to fail. They had in 1 year 3, 4, 5, and in the next year they had another 5 or 6 fail, and they were reacting each time. And instead, with high risk components, they could require the owners to step up and proactively replace something that was on the eve of failure anyway. So think about those components and ask yourself, you know, how do we want to troubleshoot these? What can we put over on the owner? This is a section that doesn't get used a whole lot, sometimes more in high rises than low rises, but it is a safety net, if you will, for a board that's grappling with a large number of claims. You go to this section and say, what are the tools that we have to try and get a handle on this? So it's an opportunity. You won't see it in most documents. It's kind of been dreamed up by some of us on the front line. Okay, let's on next list, if we get into bylaws. Now the bylaws, I've already told you, a little more on the boring side. But there are bells and whistles, even though it's heavily dominated by the corporations code It's heavily dominated by aspects of the Davis-Sterling Act. There are things that we can tweak to make our lives easier. And so, for some of you, you'll remember the old days where you had to have an annual meeting and a quorum of owners, and a quorum was often a full majority of all of your owners. So people would be out there running around to get proxies so you could make quorum to get anything done. But the reality is you can set your quorums wherever you want. And so, for example, a popular trend now for election of directors is the number of votes received. Well, that's pretty cool, because that guarantees you won't have to have a problem with your elections. You get the turnout. You work really hard to get the turnout, but you won't have to worry about missing quorum and having a holdover board and all of the headaches that can come from that. And so you get the lowest quorums there if you have a tradition of a tax resolution at the end of the year with respect to rolling over funds. That's almost like a rite of passage. It's a routine annually. People do that. Why not have a quorum that's the number of votes received or the number of ballots received? Why not have that quorum? Why have a bigger number? It's just ministerial and it'll satisfy the IRS. But there are other areas where if you're, for example, amending bylaws or CC&Rs, that should be a much bigger percentage. And by the way, the Davis-Sterling Act for some subjects says what a percentage is, and then says unless otherwise provided in the documents. So be realistic on all the things that get voted on and decide what percentage, what the quorum should be. It's an opportunity to make your life easier. Even something as simple as approval of minutes. Most association documents don't address who approves minutes, but the reality is there's nobody anywhere that says this is exactly how you have to do, for example, annual meeting minutes. Even if it's an informational meeting, how many of us been to that annual meeting and that minutes from the prior year come up and who knows whether they're accurate or not, whatever's drafted out there. Well, in your documents, you can actually plug in there that the minutes can be approved by the board of directors after 30 or 60 days or on the regular agenda. That approval of the minutes is acceptable then. So think about how the minutes are approved. Member notice options, yeah, that's heavily dominated by the Davis-Sterling Act. So you want to make sure those aspects are up to date. Voting timelines or something probably more for a policy. Acclamation, many of the most of the old documents didn't have acclamation at all. Then it started creeping in as a policy, and quite a few attorneys said, well, if it's in your documents, you can do that. And now the legislature has jumped in and they have heavily regulated it. It's a subject that should be addressed, but it's dominated by the statute that's now in place. But it's a subject you should get into anyway in your bylaws. Okay, let's keep up to got a handful of other things that I wanted to bring up. And some of the material that you're going to be getting a link to, some of the documents. I wanted to give you kind of brainstorm some of the areas where oh gosh, I want to give you an idea of sort of my wish list. And this is a real list. I'm just going to speed through. You'll have it in writing. But these are actual examples of when I look at condominium minutes and records, and aluminum wiring, circuit breaker panels, who's responsible? You'll hear that most of those from 10 or 15 years or more have all been recalled. Who does the circuit breaker panels? Clunker cars, common hallway odors, damaged elastomeric deck railings that aren't to code, double pane fogged windows, driveway cracks, electric vehicle charging stations, earthquake insurance, another great subject, feeding birds and deer and attracting skunks, fire sprinkler heads and access to do repairs on those things, guest parking, moisture in the crawl space, moving out during repairs, neighbor to neighbor disputes, owner landscape, patio cracks, patio landscaping interfering with painting, pest control companies, pests, rats, and ants and bats, pets on decks, requests for wheelchair ramps, owner email list, rodents in the attics, and the soiling of the attics and who's responsible to clean all of that out. Whether it's a plan development and they get in through an opening somewhere in the outside of the building, or a condominium where they're coming in through common area. How are you going to deal with pets or pests and getting in? Dogs off leash, tub overflows, underground pipe corrosion, washing machine hose burst, window mounted air conditionings. Those are all things from the condominium list. And there's an equally long list for plan development that you should come up with your wish list when you're thinking about updating the documents. And that can be everything from architectural agreements by default. If there's no separate agreement in place, you can put the terms of any agreement that's out there unless otherwise in a specific agreement. Balcony railings and decks and use, taking additional safeguards there for kids and pets, cable service contracts, catastrophic damage, changing exterior paint colors, delinquent owners while the tenant pays and the delinquent owner, landlord, pockets the money and isn't paying the assessment. What recourse do you want to build in for that? Extending decks over common area, extending yards into common area, estate sales, insurance deductibles, a lack of owner insurance, moving pods and debris boxes, new skylights in an old roof, non-functioning foundation drains, security lights, sewer laterals, smoking around the common area, suspending rights to use facilities, termites, tree leaf debris, tree ownership and control, root damage, troubleshooting leaks. Those are the real deal things. If you didn't write fast enough, don't worry, those on the list that you're going to get. But mostly what I wanted to give you an example those are the things that it's almost like a scavenger hunt. When we get into it, we're looking at the documents, we're looking at the photographs, trying to figure out and get ahead of the problems. Don't just look at the at what's there in your existing documents. Think, if in a clean slate. Now, what can you do to vet your documents? I get this question a fair amount. If you're one of the lucky directors who's going to be doing it, or a volunteer who's assisted in doing it, one of the toughest things in the world is to start page 1, line 1, and work your way through. And even with a great set of documents, it's hard to see what's not there. And you can do page 1, line 1, and work your way through. But I would suggest that other than just browsing through quickly, looking at that, a better way to do it is like the old days. You remember open book tests? You were sitting in high school and you'd have an open book test. You go, I've got this thing nailed. I know right where to find the stuff in the book. And think of it as there's your draft set of documents. It's an open book test. And all you need is a scenario and look for the answer. And that's the test. And so if you're unable to come up with your own scenario, one that I like to use is, there's an owner who has been transferred to the Middle East somewhere and isn't in communication regularly, and the time is way off. He has given a proxy to his brother-in-law who lives in New York. And whenever the manager needs to make a decision, they try to get the brother-in-law to make a decision, who then says he needs to check with the owner, and days and days and days can go by. And here's the problem. They have a tenant who's got a pit bull, a pickup truck, a gun rack in the pickup truck, and a disdain for everybody in the place. And that guy's backing out, backs over a fire plug, knocks that out, water floods one of the units. The guy drives off, there's trash blowing in the wind, water spouting all over the place. And the guy in the truck, the tenant in the truck, drives off, flipping off anybody who came out to see what was going on. All right, there's your scenario. Now get into your draft documents, and what are the sections you're going to start to look at? Table of contents is really important when you start that, because you'll see how things are grouped. You're going to want to look at rentals in there, because that section may well have owners responsible for any kind of problem caused by the renter, damage caused. And there is an old truism you've probably heard: no bad dogs, just bad owners. Well, it's pretty much the same thing. No bad tenants, just bad landlords. Because if the association is going to try and do something with respect to the tenant, don't let the owner off the hook. You should have a provision in the owner section. So now you figure out that the owner is responsible, but how are you going to communicate with the owner? Well, the answer is they don't. If they're not going to communicate, you're going to conduct a hearing in the hearing section. Then that will be laid out, and then the options would include, for example, a reimbursement assessment, and that can become a lien on the place if the owner doesn't pay. You don't need a whole lot of communication with the owner. I mean, you have to push it out, but you don't have to engage with them and play the game that it's difficult to get a hold of. So as you go through this open book test, if you will, you'll find that sometimes things are covered well in the documents. If you can't find it, if you're not seeing it, then bring that up too, because no set of documents is perfect, and you may be able to have a scenario that hasn't been addressed in the documents. But just because you've had your imagination doesn't mean that it isn't something that should not be addressed. So yeah, go ahead and get that addressed. So that's my quick once over. We're a little bit ahead of time, but I also suspect that lots of people show up to these things, and a big reason is you've got one question or two questions. The governing documents are really an avenue into all aspects of operating associations and even the psychology of managing people. So I think I'm happy to field questions, and we can start in on that.
Well, hold on just one second, because I want to recognize our sponsors for today. So thank you, Glenn, so much for your presentation. We are, I think, just a tad ahead of schedule of 10 minutes. So we'll have 30 minutes of Q&A. But I want to say thank you to Kevin Boland from the Kevin Boland Insurance Agency for sponsoring the Q&A session today. So thank you so much, Kevin. You make this possible for so many of us to attend at a very affordable price. So let's go ahead, and also I'd like to ask our attendees to use the upvote feature in the Q&A feature. So there's an upvote, a little thumbs up, and vote on your favorite questions. That way we'll get the most votes will be answered first, unless they're really complicated or too specific to your particular property. But use the upvote. We're going to give them a couple seconds here, Glenn, to do that, and then we'll get right back to you.
All right. And I've got a comment in the interim, and mentioning Kevin and Farmers brings it back to mind. When you're doing your documents, you want your insurance agent to be in the loop. And one of the things that is popular with a lot of associations is, because of the number of claims and the difficulty getting insurance, they're trying to put more responsibility over onto the individual owners. And you can do that in your documents when you update them. And so when you talk to somebody like Kevin or one of the other agents that's involved with ECHO that does a lot of association work, you're going to find they'll say, well, you could do walls in, or you may have a deductible that's $10,000. Well, if you have a $10,000 deductible, you want to make sure that the owners are required to have their own insurance that will supplement and dovetail to that. And so the subject of insurance is a really important facet. And seeing Kevin's name there, and there are some other great agents that are involved with ECHO that are way familiar with associations, and you can talk to them about risk management, and then what subjects you want to get into. The attorney helping you draft the documents can help with that. Also, the agent can help with that and what's out there in the marketplace. So thank you for bringing up Kevin's name and the subject of insurance.
Yeah, and I'm sure Kevin's happy to answer any questions. And he's just a great guy. He is also a sponsor of the North Bay Resource Panel. So if anybody's in Marin County or in the North Bay and or San Francisco and wants to come up to that, we have those meetings every other month. So nice opportunity to get to know him too. So thank you so much. This is good. We have the upvotes. I'll make sure you're putting your questions in the Q&A feature and not in the chat. I'm not looking at the chat at this point. So here's from an anonymous attendee with 18 upvotes. Is it proper to include a mandatory ethics policy for directors and committee members in the CC&Rs? We had adopted a board policy, but it keeps getting overruled in particular instances by the board majority votes. I hear this a lot, Lance. So maybe you can help.
It's a good subject. In my opinion, is a little bit counterintuitive. First of all, as far as what goes into the documents themselves, I think that it's a mistake to try and codify that, if you will, to legislate it into the bylaws as a part of those documents. And what I have ended up doing over time, because every once in a while you'll find a rogue director out there, and the other directors are saying, "What can we possibly do?" We put into our bylaws a section that says, act in the best interest of the corporation and the membership generally, and respect the confidentiality of subject matter, things like that. The reason we put that in the bylaws is it's straight corporate director standard of care that we put in there. But if it gets violated several times, then it's a violation of the governing documents, and the board has the traction then to conduct a hearing, and then there can be consequences that are more significant to the rogue director. Now, having said that, I don't recommend putting in an ethics policy or a standard of conduct policy there, but some people do adopt them. And in my experience, the board that adopts it is trying to solve a problem by getting the person who's rogue to not. That very often, and then that person doesn't abide by it anyway. And then a year or two later, it comes back to bite the directors who are working hard because they've forgotten about it by then, and somebody accuses them of violating their own policy, and now you have a brouhaha over that. I'm not a big fan of those policies. I think that people tend to want to use them as a band-aid, thinking that it's going to be a simple fix. But enforcing those policies is enormously difficult, which means that if the good guys accidentally violate it, it can be used as a tool to kind of bludgeon them. And the bad guys aren't going to pay a lot of attention anyway. So I like having those out there. I like reminding them. If a board said, "Here's one that's been adopted," got it off the internet or somewhere else, we should all familiarize ourselves and know that we have these responsibilities to ourselves. I'm all on board with that as a reminder, but passing a formal policy, I've seen it harm more than it's helped in the long run.
That's a great answer. And what I'd like to say is that ECHO has its first class on ethics. It's going to be held on February 22nd and 23rd. You might, if you're interested in ethics, you might go ahead and sign up for that class. It's the first time we've done it in a class format. It'll be limited to the number of people that we have so that you'll have a lot more interaction with everybody. So good question, good answer. And I think it's a term of art. I think really it depends on your community. Okay, so here's 20 upvotes. In a thorough rewrite of CC&Rs, is it okay to ask members to vote not only on the major rewrite, but also separately vote on a very small number of proposed additional amendments, e.g. a new set of parking rules?
There's two parts to that. First part is you're headed down the road probably for procedural disaster if you try to get your owners to vote on subparts of the document. You need to get ahead of it with the owners, figure out what those hot button subjects are, and involve them in the process ahead of time. Logistically, it is almost impossible to set up a ballot where they can vote subparts. It's ugly and it's complicated. So it increases the likelihood of failure of the entire document if you try and get that complicated. So as much as I know your heart's in the right place, do the homework ahead of time and then integrate that into the document. Now, if you run across, you suppose you've already finished the draft, maybe even you've put it out for a vote, and then somebody says, "Hey, what about this?" or "What about that?" It may be that the board would want to do what we call a mini amendment, where it's not the whole document, but it's just a particular subject. The good news of a mini amendment is it's a lot easier to just tackle that subject and people can understand what it is. But sort of the bad news is it's usually a controversial subject and now it has nothing else around it. And people will really hyper focus on it and it can begin to divide the community. So I think that part of the leadership role of the board is to figure out what these subjects are, to poll people, to put the questionnaire out there, invite them for their input, try and get a good sense for that, and then cut that off. And when somebody says, "Well, what about this?" late in the game, just say, "Hey, we've already been there. We took our consensus, we took the poll, and this is what we agonized and we decided this is what's best for our community." Then put it to a vote, all within the one document.
Okay, great answer. The next question: modifying rules and policies is a much more flexible process than changing the CC&Rs. Would you agree that it makes more sense to define items that may change or require ongoing monitoring in the rules and policies for this reason?
Yes, I'm on board with that. Probably 80% yes to that. And I like the CC&Rs to say that the board can adopt policies or rules which include, and then have your list of the kinds of things that you might adopt a policy for. That's an anchor then. It ties it into the CC&Rs and it's clear that there's not going to be a conflict. And then you want the flexibility of going into a rule. If you put too much into the CC&Rs, the board cannot adopt a rule that conflicts with the CC&Rs. It won't work. So yes, there's that balance. Now, I mentioned a little earlier, I generally will go a little heavier into a subject like parking, for example, to add some detail carefully, because I want that presumption of validity in the event of a dispute. There may be other areas where you want that presumption of validity and you give up a little flexibility when you cast it in stone in the CC&Rs, but you know that it's going to be very difficult for somebody to challenge. But on most things, we do want the flexibility. And then it comes back down into the policies, and the boards can change those, and they do change them on a regular basis. Certainly after you update your documents overall, the CC&Rs and the bylaws, update those, you should go back and look at your rules to make sure they conform, but also so that they're updated. Your rules for electric vehicle charging stations, do you have that? Is it in your parking? Is there a separate policy that's there? There are reasons why you should update, especially after you've redone bylaws and CC&Rs.
Okay, and if the law changes, how do you handle the CC&Rs if the law changes? You have to keep going back into the policy or into the CC&Rs and amending them? That's expensive.
Yeah, and that is a perpetual challenge. It will be with us forever, I predict. What do you do as the legislature gradually erodes the bylaws and the CC&Rs? And there are, I've got several tools that we can work with. Now it's getting more and more common that you'll find attorneys will draft into both the CC&Rs and the bylaws a section that says that the board has the authority to amend that part of the bylaws or CC&Rs if it's to conform to a change in the law. Bingo. Now it's the same standard that you'd have for rules, except the board has the authority without involving all of the owners. That will give you the ability to update the documents periodically to freshen them up, if you will, and not have to go through the whole process of involving the members in a big heavy duty ballot. Now, there are other areas where the board can pass a policy and can be more specific. And you'll just need to know, it might be the voting policy or architectural, something like that, where the policy is the accurate place to go. And often people will just draw a line through that section in the bylaws or CC&Rs and say, see policy. And that's just the poor man's approach to updating so that you don't get mired down in the wrong place. But there are now, the legislature has actually crossed that bridge where they said, oh, you must enforce change. And so rather than must adopt a policy to bridge the gap between outdated documents and the current law, everybody should be aware that they came in and jumped on the subject of rentals. And they came in and with rentals said, hey, guys, you cannot put on an unreasonable restriction. And all the rental restrictions that are already in place in so many documents became outdated. And the legislature said, you need to change that. And at first they didn't give any guidance. And then after that, they said, oh, well, the board can actually change that part, probably. So there again, the idea is back to the board. And then there comes a point where it's just cumulatively needs the overhaul. We have had documents where the directors have said, we're just not ready to go back for the big overhaul yet, but we're tired of all of these exceptions and they are pretty outdated. Can you prepare for us, please, what they call the teacher's edition? And the teacher's edition is where we go through the existing document and we annotate in the margin and put the new reference that says see Civil Code section blank, blank, blank. And we actually will put that in. So like the teacher's edition, the owners don't see that, but the directors have a good way to navigate through the changes that are there. In one extreme case, and I wasn't sure how this was going to turn out, these documents went back to, oh gosh, it was 48, 49, 50. And there were racial restrictions that were in there. And this was quite a few years back. And these documents were way old. And it was obviously long before what we know of as community associations. But the documents were still there. And there was no way in the world to get thousands of people to vote on updating the documents. Just wasn't going to happen. And so because the legislature said you have to pull out the racial restrictions and restate the document, we jumped on that and we restated the entire document. And what we put in was we had the old language verbatim that we weren't amending because we didn't have the authority. And then we put little boxes to say, subsequently, Civil Code section whatever now addresses this with the following. And then we put a note on the front that said that we're not amending these old sections, but we have notes to assist in reading through. And we did that, and we got a cleaner looking document. And it was a little bit of a Frankenstein document, but everybody felt better because it became clear that in the areas we couldn't rely on the document, we were giving cross references and language, for example, on assessments and things like that. We plugged that in. And there was one owner who had a beef with the association on another matter and decided to throw this one in and sued and said that it's an improper set of CC&Rs because it had changes that weren't approved by the members. And the appellate court said it didn't change the document text. All it did was add commentary boxes, note boxes. That doesn't change the underlying document. And then they went ahead and complimented the association on their creativity. So there are some workarounds. And that's an appellate decision. It's unpublished, unfortunately, but it is out there and available. That's a workaround. If you really are stuck and you find you really have to do something, there are those workarounds.
Okay, that sounds great. That was a good answer. When distributing, so we have about 14 minutes left here. So when distributing revised governing documents like the CC&Rs for a member vote, can you ask the members to state points of disagreement if the vote against is revised against the vote against the documents, I presume, is against the revised document? Otherwise, it's difficult to prepare another revision that gets approved if you don't understand why they voted it down. So in essence.
Yeah, troubleshooting the people, and sometimes despite your best efforts, people aren't paying any attention to what you're doing. And then they get all excited later on when the paperwork's already rolling. And how do you get around that? Sometimes there's enough flexibility in the concept that the board can actually push a policy or a rule one way or the other without violating the new document that hopefully is going to pass. In a few instances where truly something has come up and the board has said, yeah, we'd like to get that out there. And they've committed communication to the members that this has come up as a late subject. We need to get the documents overall updated. We are pledging to you that immediately we are putting together a mini amendment so you can vote on that. And if the mini amendment passes, we'll integrate it into the master document. If it doesn't pass, then the master document will go through as is. It's a little bit walking a fine line, especially with the timing on something like this. But we've been there. We've been there in order to salvage the 95% what everybody agrees on, and yet do honor to the 5% that we might have gotten a little bushwhacked on timing, but where it's a legitimate subject. So that is possible, and sometimes we can integrate this sort of mini concept in, or sometimes it's the pledge that the board is going to put it through right afterwards. And if it's in some respects, the board can say with a resolution that it came up, tell it like it is, and that the board is not going to be enforcing this during the period of time that the mini amendment is out there for a vote. And then it will act accordingly after that vote comes in. So not happy to be there, better to do the work ahead, flush it out if at all possible. But you can get creative to try and save the process when you're way down the road.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question from Stuart Sexton. If the law contains the words notwithstanding any contrary provision in the governing documents, does that mean the law is absolute or that more restrictive provisions in the governing documents prevail?
Notwithstanding what's in your documents, my opinion on that is it means you look at the statute. They use slightly different language in different places, but when you see notwithstanding what's in your documents, boom, here it is. That's usually going to be in the area of finance. It's going to be assessments. It's going to be finance reporting requirements. It may even be notice requirements, things like that. The legislature wants to preempt that. Preempt is the fancy word that lawyers like to use that says, doesn't matter what's in your documents, this is what it is. So notwithstanding what's in your documents, if you have a more difficult standard, there are some things there that say, there are some provisions in the Davis-Sterling Act that say, unless your documents provide for a lower interest rate on delinquencies, it shall be 12%. Okay. And some old documents have 10%. Drives the managers and the accountants crazy because none of the computers are set up, the formulas and the software are set up for that. But you can get bushwhacked because it does say that unless it's a higher standard or a more restrictive standard. So you really have to watch. The legislature deals with it in different ways depending on the subject.
Okay, well, here's one that we hear a lot about often. Is it ever possible to amend the CC&Rs when the current ones require 75% of the voting power to approve the amended ones. It's hard to even get 50% of the votes. What do you do if you can't get enough people to vote? Apathy in the community.
Well, good subject, and I should have brought this up earlier. So thank you for bringing it up. Generally, developer documents, in my experience, say 75%. And, I've often thought you couldn't get 75% of the people to accept money if you wanted to hand it to them. I mean, it's just difficult. Apathy is a huge problem. And the legislature said, hey, we're with you on this. We understand. And if you have 75%, we will permit you to petition the court and make your case. And the court can then, with an order, lower it to a simple majority of the owners approving it. So it's an extra cost. It may cost several $1,000s to petition the court. And a lot of judges don't understand what to do with these things. They're so rare when they see them, but it is entirely possible. And for people who draft documents, I'm sure that they also probably, I hope they have experience with drafting petitions, because especially in the promotional and the communications with your owners to try and get the vote out, all of that becomes an integral part of the petition to the court, because the judge is going to want to see that this really probably was apathy. Doesn't have to be wholly apathy, but that was a factor, and that you've got a majority of the owners in support, and the judge can flip through and look at the flyers and look at the material to try and motivate people to vote. So if you might be able to get it down from 75% to a simple majority by petitioning the court. When you update your documents, lower that percentage. And a lot depends on the size of the association. A simple majority for 14 townhouses is a lot different than 300 or 400 condominiums. So think about what's going to work for you. And that's one of the joys of drafting your documents and updating them. You need some checks and balances. It's not just enough to get the document in place. You need community participation with these fundamental documents. But what's a percentage that's going to work in the future? I'd say probably the majority of those that we work on, it's a simple majority of the owners. There's no quorum involved in this part, but there could be. I've had people say, well, it's, for example, in our bylaws, because we want that to be even easier, why don't we just have it a quorum of owners and then a majority of the quorum to pass the bylaws? And I can live with that. That gets the number down pretty far. Bylaws get outdated pretty quickly with the legislature changing procedures and notices and safeguards and things. So we go ahead and we can do that. But with the CC&Rs, get it down. And if you can't do it with the 75% there, consider a petition.
Okay, well, here's going on to fines and how to get people's behavior to change. How do you control people who are serial bad behaviors? Is there a fine limit per law? Do you have to, or what are the rules around establishing fines? And obviously, if you just have it up there without the fines, the regulation becomes null and void. So,
a couple of things about fines. First of all, there's a lot of people out there will say that you have to have a fine policy. And actually, if you look at the Davis-Sterling Act, it says if you have a fine routine or policy or practices, then you must have a policy. So you can't have an unwritten fine policy. But for some associations, they don't have a fine policy at all. If you don't have one, you're not required to have one. So it's not one of those policies. Now, a little bit on theory and philosophy on fines is that fines, to me, are a pure punishment, if you will. It's not a reimbursement assessment. It's not the cost of repair. It's not the extra cost of a management or even an attorney. That's a reimbursement assessment. That Davis-Sterling is a little waffly. They talk about monetary penalties. What's that? Is it a fine? Is it a reimbursement assessment? That should be clear in your documents. It's a little muddled in Davis-Sterling. But when I talk about fine, and I think what you're talking about is the pure penalty, it's a $100 fine for the first violation and $100 for the second one, or however that is. If you're going to have that kind of a fine policy, which I think is fine, that's okay. People tend to go to, it's 100 for the first, to 200 for the second, whatever it might be. You have to be very careful that those fines can mount up. And if the fine doesn't accomplish the task, then you look ridiculous after a while when it's up to $1,000 a month. And you call the attorney after a year and you say, we want you to collect this $12,000. You've got no credibility left when the fine has grown that large. So a fine that is not enforceable is something that is can be a hindrance rather than a help. And the guy, whoever the person is who's got the bad behavior, is just going to be thumbing their nose at you. Take your best shot. You're not going to be able to collect that because you're not going to sue me in small claims court. You're lazy. So usually the better tool is in the reimbursement assessment, that single call to the attorney to say, can you coach me through this? The extra time of the manager related to a hearing. When you have that hearing and you determine there's a violation and you levy a reimbursement assessment, you can tack that on. And if it's in your documents, that could become a lien when they thumb their nose up at you. And sometimes you may decide, well, we'll let it go until they sell, and they'll come back later and they'll pay that lien. Other times you may want to rattle the saber. But the guy who's arrogant, the person who's arrogant in their violations or really sloppy, when they see a lien on their property, they will start to come around. Now, with respect to fines, if you have a fine policy and you have examples, I always like to see lower numbers because you want to sort of aggravate people a little bit without insulting people. And you have that part. It's really important to put into your fine policy. However, because you're going to have a hearing. However, that the fine of a more appropriate amount or range may be identified in the notice of hearing. And because you're going to have the hearing anyway. That gives you the flexibility of a mundane fine policy with relatively low amounts. But when you find out there's some really serious violation or a heavy duty bad actor, and you want to be able to hit them harder with a fine earlier on to get them to respond, you put it in the notice. And you have that flexibility because it says, unless it's otherwise stated in the notice. And because it goes in the notice, the person knows they're potentially subject to a larger dollar amount before the hearing takes place. So they've got that in advance. I think when you properly use the 1-2 punch of a reimbursement assessment and fines, what I personally like to see as a starting point for the consequences is the reimbursement assessment isn't going to go away. Bang, that's going to be it. They're going to have to write that check. Then secondly, with respect to the fine, if they correct the architectural violation, or if there are no other violations for 6 months, you'll suspend imposition of the fine. And then if they don't get their act together, you're going to hit them a second time and you're going to throw the fine in. When you see that, it's like probation. And if you end up with a mediator or a judge looking at it, they love that kind of stuff. It's like probation. Give them a second chance. And so with the fines, I think that is a good use of fines. The using it as a carrot stick approach, I like that a lot. And then hit them hard with the reimbursement assessment if it's really a serious bad actor. And remember that it's landlords. And while we're on the subject of, because so many of the problems that we run across are tenant oriented and the landlord not being proactive enough, early on you've got to really put the leverage to the landlord saying this is going to cost you a fortune in the reimbursement assessment and all of that sort of thing, and wait for them to come forward with a plan. So the fine might be that we've got the reimbursement assessment, we have a fine of $500, but if you submit within 2 weeks a plan to deal with your tenant that's acceptable to the board, then we may waive the fine. And what are you looking for there? You've got the fine that's sitting there and you're motivating the landlord to come up with a plan. And that plan might well be, I'm going to evict or I'm not going to renew. But it's the landlord who's forced into doing that. And what you end up with is an alliance, an uneasy alliance perhaps, but an alliance nonetheless, because the landlord really has the best leverage to deal with a bad tenant.
Okay, good. We have about 2 minutes left to go here. 2 quick ones. How long will it take to do governing documents? And I know that some people are gasping out there at the cost of doing this, especially small, because we have a lot of small self-managed HOAs. To how much is it going to cost? What are the ranges? Just a little bit about that. That would be helpful.
Yeah, cost. The problem is that it's the same process, whether it's 10 or whether it's 100 or even whether it's 1,000. There's not a whole lot of difference in a good set of documents because it's about the people, the preferences, the bylaws. Not so much. Maybe that's more one size fits all. Not exactly, but it's that's it's unfortunately it ends up to be expensive. And I'll tell you that I've had associations just said, wait, that's just way too much money. But in a sense, it's the best investment you can make because it's an insurance policy of out of control lawyer fees and litigation later on by getting ahead of a problem and solving it before it goes down that path. It's a little bit like having insurance. You could say, oh my gosh, I can't really afford insurance, but if something goes wrong, it's going to cost you a hell of a lot more than the insurance. So put it in the budget, start saving up, perhaps even, especially assess your members, whatever you're going to do. But you're not going to find somebody that's going to deliver a quality product that's customized, for a couple $100, or somebody that takes it off the shelf. Or, I run across it still where some do-gooder, maybe a director, maybe somebody in the association says, oh, I deal with corporate law all the time. I can come up with a set of documents, and they have all kinds of errors in them because they don't keep up with the nuances of community association law. So sorry about the dollar amount, but that's a practical problem. As far as the time to get it involved, you always want to start with the budget period and think, what's available then, what can we get into the budget? How long does it take? It varies. It varies on who's doing it for you and how many sets they have as backlog. And that's a fair question at the very front end to talk about is tell me about the process. How long does the process take? And what's our target date then when we're going to put this to a vote? And voting has become complicated enough now. You really at the very front end need to plot through that so that you can get through all the notice procedures and the double envelope secret ballot and avoid voting in the middle of the holidays and all of that sort of thing.
Okay, so it varies. So we're looking at a pretty good.
It varies.
Yeah. So I think we're at time to call it a do. I want to say thank you so much, Glenn, for your time and your expertise. I think everyone appreciates that. So thank you also to our sponsors today, especially the Kevin Boland Insurance Agency and Levy Erlinger and Company. We appreciate everything that they do for us. I want to say thank you to our ECHO members for coming today and supporting our ongoing ECHO webinars. For those of you joining us today who are not members, you are invited to become a member. You or your community can join by just going to the www.echo-ca.org website and clicking on the membership tab. For our members, please invite your friends, boards, and especially management firms and vendors to join ECHO. A simple invitation is often all it takes to encourage a person to become a member of ECHO. Please help us grow ECHO and continue our excellence in education. In 2023, ECHO plans to hold more than 70 online events, 3 in-person educational seminars, and more than 30 in-person resource panels. This year, ECHO is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and we have special activities planned throughout the year, including a grand 50th anniversary celebration scheduled for Friday, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. We will be sending a registration information out after this event in the next few weeks, and we hope to see you, to see all of our ECHO members there. And it's an amazing milestone for us. So thank you for that. We are one of the oldest, or actually the oldest association of this type in the nation. If you have some time and would like to become involved with ECHO, we have a few opportunities that might be interesting to you. Please refer to the slide. And if you see anything that looks interesting, please send me an email and I'd be happy to consider including you. And now for announcements, for some other announcements. Our next in-person event is February 15th, that's next week, at the Central Coast Resource Panel in Marin County, or excuse me, in Santa Cruz County in Capitola. I look forward to seeing you there. If you're going to be there, I'll be there. With all the storms rolling through California recently, we are holding a special event on water damage and mold awareness. We hope to see you there. Also, we invite any HOA board members, board members or former board members to join us for the ECHO Board Members Club. The club meets online every second Tuesday of the month from 5:30 to 7 p.m. with one exception, and that's next week. Our February 14th meeting has been moved to February 16th. And if you don't know why, you have to look it up. So February 14th is, of course, Valentine's Day, and we don't want to conflict with Valentine's Day. So remember that date. So February 16th, we're going to have a special board members club. And fitting for Valentine's Day, our discussion next week will be about who's my favorite, a conversation about outstanding performers in the HOA industry. This is your chance to exchange information about your vendors and suppliers, management firms, even attorneys, in a private and secure way, if you join the club. The BMC, or Board Members Club, meeting is open only to ECHO members and those who serve or have served on an HOA board. No professional service providers will be admitted to this private event. We hope you'll be able to attend. It should be a lot of fun and very, very interesting. For more information, please contact Connor at echo-ca.org, and he'll take care of you. Once again, thank you to all of our sponsors who made this webinar possible, and to all of you for attending today. ECHO appreciates your investment in education to help build a better quality of life in HOA communities.